Live, Corné.
Great. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Good to have so many participants in this webinar from all around the world, streaming on Zoom and YouTube. As chair of Atlas, I'm very honored to welcome you to this joint webinar of four of our special interest groups: orphanage tourism, volunteer tourism, heritage tourism and education, and dark tourism. Since its establishment around 35 years ago, Atlas has always been aiming to be at the forefront of promoting knowledge exchange and bringing together researchers, lecturers, students, as well as practitioners who share a commitment to shaping the future of tourism and leisure. And the 18 in total special interest groups are, I think, at the core of that mission, creating groups of scholars and lecturers, practitioners, where focused expertise and a diversity of perspectives come together. And today's webinar, which is titled Consuming Lives, Consuming Places, a debate on the shadows of travel, is, I think, a highly thought-provoking one. By bringing together four SIGs in one combined webinar under one team, we today have the opportunity to explore some of the maybe more uncomfortable and morally complex dimensions of tourism, such as dark tourism and its relationship with disaster and death, to ethical dilemmas of volunteer tourism, to the ways in which heritage places are consumed by visitors. And yeah, these are not always easy conversations, but I think they are necessary, and at the same time, they are also highly interesting. So I'm therefore very much looking forward to the four contributions of today and to the open debate that will follow the presentations. It is through these kind of dialogues that the field of tourism and leisure will grow and mature, I think. So on behalf of the Atlas Board and Association, I wish you all a very stimulating and insightful webinar. And I'm now pleased to hand over to one of the moderators of today, Konstantina Zerva. Enjoy the webinar and the discussion, and thanks a lot, and keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you everyone for connecting today in our webinar. I'd like to thank Atlas Association for giving us the space and the organization and the logistics to actually combine these four SIGs, let's say, and the different thematics that they are talking about. We had to, in different conversations, realize that there are some things in common we have, and in the different conferences that the Atlas organizes, we have seen that there are many topics we would like to combine and talk and create a common space of conversation. So today we are launching, let's say, this kind of webinar that has to do with consuming lives, consuming places, a debate on the shadows of travel. Unfortunately speaking, we live in a time that there are many, many shadows around us as we speak. And we think that this kind of webinar, even though when we thought about it, things were not exactly like this, is quite relevant from what is happening. And so my objective here is to moderate the four great speakers that we have invited. Every SIG has invited a specialist in the field, and to speak. And at the end, we're going to have a debate regarding all the issues where everyone that is here present can make their questions. So I would like to start with our first presenter for today, Dr. Philip Stone. Dr. Philip Stone is the co-founder and director of the Institute for Dark Tourism Research, a globally recognized scholar ranked in the top 2% of research for research impact. He's the founder and editor-in-chief in the International Journal of Dark Tourism Studies and has authored several landmark books on dark tourism and difficult heritage. His presentation is entitled Death, the Epistemic Shadows of Tourism. So please, Dr. Stone, whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, good morning and good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining me. I've got a script to keep the time. I don't normally do a script. I normally do it ad hoc, so I'm going to keep the time, I promise. I'm just going to share the screen with you, and I'm happy to share the script as well via online for those who want it. So I'm hoping you can see that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So today I want to rethink how we conceptualize dark tourism. Specifically, I want to explore how what we call epistemic shadows, allow us to move beyond the typological frameworks that have dominated the field for almost 3 decades. There's some on again. Okay. My core proposition is simple. Dark tourism is not a fixed category. It is an assemblage. And to understand this assemblage, we must understand what becomes visible, what remains invisible, and how these patterns shape the way death is curated, consumed, and made meaningful. Let me begin with why this reconceptualization or conceptual shift is needed. Since the late 1990s, dark tourism has become a global academic conversation, cutting across tourism studies, heritage, sociology, anthropology, thanatology, to name but a few disciplines. At the same time, popular culture and the global media have largely embraced the concept, often enthusiastically, but also sometimes sensationally. Yet despite this growth, we continue to rely heavily on typologies, taxonomies, and degrees or shades of darkness. These were incredibly useful for the field to study during its initial development. They helped consolidate early discourse and legitimize its analytical boundaries. But today, these frameworks can limit theoretical development. Dark tourism is no longer an emerging field asking, what is dark tourism? It is a mature field that should be asking, how is dark tourism assembled? Through which forces and with what consequences? Let's consider typologies more closely. Early scholarship understandably sought conceptual clarity. For example, Miles, 2002, used the darker distinction of visit sites of geographical authenticity. Strange and Kemper, 2003, offers shades of dark tourism within penal heritage. Sharpley, 2005, gave us an arbitrary matrix of dark tourism with different shades of grey. Myself in 2006 produced the foundational dark tourism spectrum typology, outlining darkness to lightness with binary parameters. And there are other schemas that offer similar degrees of darkness. These models map the landscape, but also created a classificationally center of gravity that the field has struggled to escape. These early dark tourism typologies tended to stabilize sites into neat conceptual boxes, privileged institutional framings, universalize Western secular death regimes, imply linearity, that is, binary progressions from light to dark and vice versa. Foregrounds supply while muting lived, embodied, and effective tourist experiences. And it risks, or does risk, turning dark tourism into a managerial resource rather than a critical lens. Even I myself has acknowledged limitations of the spectrum model, but its dominance persists, certainly in the literature and citations, not because of conceptual position, but because of its visual simplicity and pedagogical convenience. However, the field has reached a point now where typologies have become an orthodoxy, and as orthodoxy, they have obscured more they can illuminate. To move on beyond this static classification, I therefore offer the concept of epistemic shadows. Epistemic shadows are the pattern zones of visibility and invisibility that structure how dark tourism, indeed how death itself, is made intelligible within visit economies. Shadows are not simply gaps or absences, they are productive forces that actively shape what is shown, what is hidden, what can be said, what can be felt, who can speak, which death matters, and which deaths do not. In this sense, shadows are analytical tools. They help us trace how different forces, discursive, political, material, affective, assemble dark tourism as a coherent field. Today, I'll briefly map these shadows across three theoretical terrains and interlocking lenses. Firstly, post-structuralism. Secondly, thanatology and necropolitics. And thirdly, new materialism. Together, these lenses resembled or reassembled dark tourism as a bounded category, or not as a bounded category, but as an ongoing and relational process. Post-structuralism offers our first set of shadows. Here, categories like dark tourism do not describe the world so much as help shape it. This means dark tourism is not discovered, it is produced. This production happens through institutional discourses, museum practices, interpretive technologies, heritage policy, academic writing, tourism marketing, and visitor expectations and experiences, to name but a few. At dark tourism sites, these forces come together to create regimes of truth. So what does this look like in practice? Dark tourism sites can curate authorized narratives, discipline visitor behavior, for example, with instructional signage such as be respectful or no photography. Rely on scenographic cues, for instance, sound, lighting, or space dramatics. Deploy moral scripts, or purposely construct effective positions. For example, you should feel solemn, or you are expected to feel solemn. Visitors may walk away feeling they have encountered objective truth. Yet that truth in a post-truth world is produced through dynamics of power and knowledge, and I'm using Foucault here as the framework, not inherent in the site. Importantly, what is not shown is just how significant in terms of silences and omissions. For instance, at certain dark tourism sites, colonial violence may be softened, racialized suffering may be minimized, economic or structural causes of atrocity may be missing, perpetrators may be sanitized, or marginal narratives, women, children, the oppressed, may be secondary or absent. These omissions form powerful epistemic shadows. They reveal how dark tourism sites mediate legitimacy and moral authority through selective narration. Post-structuralism also challenges conventional understandings of authenticity. Instead of seeing authenticity as inherent, we understand it as constructed, performed, choreographed, and discursively produced. Authenticity is not in the object. It is in the relations around the object. In short, authenticity is performative within dark tourism encounters. The second terrain is thanatology and necropolitics and the incorporation of modern death regimes. I've done a lot on thanatology, but I'm introducing here into the framework this idea of necropolitics, which I'll explain in a moment. Modern societies largely sequester ordinary death into medicalized hospitals and hospices and professional funerary services. Yet they spectacularize extraordinary death through media, memorials, and cultural heritage. Dark tourism arises in this contradiction. In other words, a culture that hides death in daily life, but displays it dramatically in curated environments. Therefore, in a new age of the spectacular death, significant death is mediated through museums and curated exhibitions or events, ruins, difficult heritage sites, visitor attractions, tourism, digital media, and marketing, as well as creative memorials and monuments. These spectralizations of death create cultural appetites and interpretive habits that shape dark tourism encounters. However, when the spectacle of death is located within the broader conceptual domain of necropolitics, the analysis goes deeper by asking who is allowed to die, whose death is publicly grievable, whose suffering becomes heritage, and who remains invisible. Dark tourism often produce necropolitical hierarchies. These hierarchies are the stuff of important epistemic shadows. Examples include genocide memorials that foreground some victims' groups while omitting others, colonial atrocity that center imperial narratives, conflict sites that frame death as heroic or necessary, or disaster zones where local populations remain marginal while global tourists consume trauma. With this conceptual lens, dark tourism becomes an arena of post-events governance, organizing the memorials afterlives of victims and perpetrators. It is here that memorializations becomes political economy, whereby memorials are markers of political remembrance, as well as moral beacons and economic assets. Therefore, sites of atrocities can become visit attractions, economic capital, political tools, cultural texts, and moral instruction devices. This duality between commerce and commemoration creates tension, but it also reveals how death becomes a resource in the visitor economy. The third domain, new materialism, moves us beyond human-centered accounts and towards a new etology. Here we shift from asking what death means to asking how matter itself participates in producing meaning. Dark tourism sites are filled with vibrant, effective, generative materialities. For example, ruins, soundscapes, atmospheres, residues, decaying structures, weather, objects, traces and remains, and so on and so forth. Matter is not passive. It helps choreograph effect in the tourist experience. It is here through new material epistemic shadows that we encounter effective assemblages. Tourist experiences emerge through interaction, not interaction, so not simply interpretation either. Consider the dryness of a desert at a genocide memorial in Africa, the cold dampness of a European former prison, the unsettling quiet of a mass grave memorial, the heavy air of a humid ruin, the echo of footsteps in an underground execution chamber. These are not symbolic enhancements. They are part of the effective architecture of the site. But new materialism also carries risks and possesses an important ethical caution. Overemphasizing material agency may inadvertently depoliticize the human violence that produced trauma in the first place. So a new materialist reading must remain ethically grounded, always tied to structural histories, political forces, violent pasts, and of course, unequal power relations. Bringing these scholarly assemblages together, we can reconceptualize dark tourism as a turn to assemblage. In other words, we can examine epistemic shadows within dark tourism production and consumption through three interlocking lenses of post-structuralism, thanatology, necropolitics, and new materialism. As a result, this produces an academic assemblage that is relational, emergent, multi-layered, effective, political, material, and of course, discursive. And an assemblage approach shifts away from categorizing dark tourism sites, as previously done. Instead, it directs us towards tracing how different forces converge to produce particular touristic formations and encounters. Consequently, dark tourism stops being a thing. It becomes a doing, a set of ongoing practices. In other words, assemblage thinking helps us dismantle essential categories, foreground complexity, capture polysemic voices, reveal entanglements, and attend to atmospheres. It also highlights hierarchies and acknowledges instability and change. It reveals dark tourism not as a bounded domain, but as a dynamic cultural practice shaped by the interplay of discourse, materiality, politics, power, effect, and memory. Let me conclude by outlining a future agenda inspired by epistemic shadows and assemblage thinking. In the future, dark tourism scholarship should integrate or interrogate visibility and erasure, that is, analyze what becomes legible and what remains hidden. Map epistemic shadows, that is, trace the shifting boundaries of knowledge, power, and representation. Foreground, effect, and atmospheres, that is, explore how emotions and sensations are produced through material semiotic encounters. Incorporate necropolitical critique, examine unequal distributions of death, grief, and memorializations. Engage with new materialisms ethically, that is, center material agency without obscuring structural violence. Move beyond typological closure, resist the temptation to stabilize dark tourism into neat categories. And that is me essentially dismantling my own work of the last 20 years or so. Amplify marginalized and subaltern voices. That is, attend to those who are suffering and underrepresented. And adopt a relational ontology. That is, treat dark tourism as an assemblage and not as that is continually emerging, contested and reconfigured. In closing, I want to suggest that dark tourism is not, and perhaps never was, a stable category. It is a spectral field, always shifting, always contested, always entangled with political, cultural, social, material, and affective forces. By tracing epistemic shadows, we can better understand how societies make death meaningful, how we remember, how we forget, how we narrate, and how we consume. Dark tourism is not about visiting sites of death. In the end, dark tourism reveals the quiet circles our significant dead draw around us, shaping our moral compass, contouring our cultural terrains, and narrating the stories that follow us into memory's afterlife. Quite simply, within the realms of dark tourism, our significant dead do not depart or fade. They stand watch and linger and become guardians of the living. Thank you. I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stone, for your presentation. And later on, definitely there are going to be quite some questions here. So now I would like to move on to our next presenter, representing the volunteer SIG. And here we have Neil Brickenhoff, who is the Marketing and Sustainability Director of the CAS TRIPS and a master graduate in Responsible Tourism Management. He finds his passion in implementing responsible tourism concepts to further develop sustainability practices within the educational opportunities offered by the trips of the CAS trips. This includes volunteering opportunities and community engagement initiatives across the itineraries organized. Thank you very much for being here. Please, whenever you want.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the introduction and for the welcome from the Atlas community for this webinar today. Really happy to be speaking on the topic of volunteerism today. My name is Neil Brinkerhoff, and as Konstantina said, I do have an MSc in Responsible Tourism Management, though volunteerism is not my academic topic of expertise, though I do have nearly a decade of professional experience in related fields. So today I will be citing a lot of the academic research in volunteerism and going through some backgrounds and challenges of the industry as a whole, and weaving in some of my professional experience with CAS trips in my role as Director in Marketing and Sustainability. Right. So let's get started with the main question that we of course have to start with, which is what is volunteerism or international volunteering, or volunteering as we can think about it. Volunteerism, of course, is two words combined, volunteering and tourism, and volunteerism is a noun. I'm citing today a book that I'll cite kind of throughout this presentation, Hours to Explore, published in 2021 by the author Pippa Biddle. The topic is fully on volunteerism and the many ethical challenges that I'm sure we're all aware exist. Volunteerism is any combination of unskilled volunteer work or skilled volunteer work, for example, in medicine or education, done by someone unqualified and traveling on a short-term basis. Volunteerism is typically done in less developed regions by people from more developed regions. International travel is not necessary for an experience to qualify as volunteerism, though it is the most common way that it exists, and most trips are shorter than 4 weeks. So this is kind of just a great preface for us to look at, but what this includes here is a presumption of progress, which is a really important aspect of volunteerism, and that it's been framed as a moral act over the last several decades by the tourism industry, so that tourists feel like they are doing good. Now, there's many types of volunteerism. Kind of the origins of this come from faith-based travel, many religious or mission-style trips, and other common aspect or types of volunteerism are gap year opportunities that a lot of young travelers are doing today. Now, many practitioners actually refrain from associating themselves through their activity, although their activity could be described as volunteerism, and this only adds to the misunderstanding and poor coordination and understanding of this industry as a whole. Of course, now we must ask who these experiences are led by, and we'll get through that as in the whole bit. But there's a lot of trip providers in volunteerism. Now, over the past decade, volunteerism has taken a sharp for-profit turn, following the overall trend of consolidation in the mass tourism industry. More and more small trip providers have been gobbled up by larger brands and are turning a profit on this altruistic behavior that volunteering really comes from. Now, look at a little bit of the volunteerism sector data. This is from the most recent literature review on the sector published a few years ago. The volunteerism sector is valued at over $2.5 billion US dollars and attracts 10 million participants each year. There are more than 800 international organizations across over 150 countries facilitating volunteer tourism projects, with the US hosting the largest number number of these organizations. Most volunteers come from the global north, as I said, and typically volunteer in the global south. Now, one false assumption is that the majority of volunteers are young, and research says that a little more than a quarter of people in the United States who reported volunteering abroad between 2004 and 2012 were between the ages of 15 and 24, which was balanced out by their older compatriots, as about 20% of volunteers in that same period were ages 45 to 54. Finally, just want to cover that there is a little bit of global governance taking place in the volunteerism world. Of course, a lot of organizations in this field, especially ones choosing to operate ethically, follow the United Nations Global Code of Ethics for Tourism, which actually is slightly linked and integrated into the UN's recently published Call to Action for the Future of Volunteering, published in November 25, which does mention many of the benefits and reasons why we should be supporting volunteering amidst, of course, many challenges. There's an organization called ECPAT, which has founded the Code of Conduct for the Protection of Children from Sexual Exploitation in Travel and Tourism, otherwise known as the Code. They have published a volunteerism policy and have been the leader on banning volunteerism visits with orphanages, citing that companies should exclude visits to orphanages as it drives this institutionalism, which causes harm to children. And I don't think I'm going to get into much more of that because we have a whole section dedicated on that today in the webinar. Finally, ABTA has volunteerism guidelines published, which are practical guides with best practices for travel companies who are delivering these experiences. Now, let's get into the meat of it and get up front with the challenges. Today, I'm going to discuss a few of the challenges that I'm most comfortable speaking on based on my experience, which are the first three: privilege and power dynamics, neocolonial and saviorism, host community leadership. But equally, there's many other challenges that exist, such as the commodification of the community's needs and culture, reinforcing stereotypes, for example, establishing the idea that they do need our help and ideas when coming to visit. Extensive carbon footprint of travel, of course, the impact of short, unimpactful visits. The cited research that from Hours to Explore examined mission trips and concluded that a cash contribution, which would often provide more economic benefit to the recipient community than a volunteerism visit. But it's unlikely that the cash contribution would have come to the community had the visit not been made. So take this paradigm as you will. Another challenge is, of course, low-skilled volunteering. Example in fields like medical fields or construction fields, there's a lot of issues here. For example, in this same example from the orphanages in Hours to Explore, Pippa's group was building a library for an orphanage and woke up every morning to discover that the locals had reconstructed and redone their work based on them not doing it properly and not having the proper skill set for these constructions. So this book really calls for a renovation of our vocabulary and behavior to remind us that empathy, which is where volunteering efforts are coming from, without evidence is dangerous and can lead to many more issues. So all of this can be summarized as good intentions causing harm. Now, as we get into those three challenges that I'd like to talk about, just briefly need to mention Cast Trips, as I'll be weaving in some examples here. Cast Trips was founded by IB educators, not tour operators, and the primary purpose here is educational development on these class trips that are offered. They follow the CAST framework, which is creativity, activity, and service. Service is, of course, where the volunteering falls under, providing curricular structure and accountability that distinguishes Cast Trips from unskilled volunteerism. Students are learning about global issues and not pretending to solve them in a week. We are a member of the code, as I've referenced, and utilize their volunteerism policies. We're also Travel Life and GSTC certified. There are many standards for partnerships included in sustainability certifications for tour operators, including your activity partnership. So this creates a standard of communications for a practitioner like us implementing these types of experiences. And we also offer an on-trip workshop that's actually highlighted on the United Nations Tourism for SDGs platform. developed to prepare participants to take action at home in their destination. And all of this is done because there's a lot of privilege, because especially young students who are traveling international, the ones we work with at least, are quite privileged. And this is the first challenge that I'll briefly discuss. Because the origins of voluntourists are mostly winners in the privilege lottery. They try to make up their position of power by obsessively striving to even the scale in these voluntourism efforts coming from the global north. They desire, it's complicated by their desires, because one of the most important pieces of a volunteerism trip is that it must be easy. Hosts should be welcoming and kind. They should invite volunteerists into their homes right after meeting them, and smile for pictures when the camera's pointed at them. And the volunteerists, on the other hand, they want simple projects with visible results. They also want free time, flexibility, and maybe private space in places where communities aren't even having their own bed. That's a luxury on their own in that community. So we must ask and ensure, what do the participants in volunteerism want to do, and ensure that they are prepared ahead of time. This is something that's done and solved through the itinerary and the development of the trip, of course, because they need proper structure, balance, and to give opportunities for reflection and growth. Castrips has a great example of this through our homeless activities, where there is a walking tour led from an organization that brings in people who used to be or still are living on the streets in Prague. They give their version of a tour before the students then develop and cook their own meal and serve it and eat it at a local shelter. We have a rotating set of shelters that we work with. And then the final activity is magazine selling. There's a magazine in Prague called Nový Prostor that is built to help people living on the streets start making cash and supporting themselves. And so rather than observing poverty through a bus window, in 2025, Castrip students spent a total of or over 1,000 hours cooking and nearly 700 hours distributing these Nový Prostor magazines, amplifying the local-led narratives and shifting the dynamic from white saviorism to more cross-cultural co-creation. And this exact activity is actually being highlighted a lot recently. A recent research study was just published this year by a UK-based organization that does these same street-led walking tours, Sama Sama, concluding that tourism works better for everyone when it's centered around the local stories and narratives. As well as a recent article published in Vogue by highlighting another organization, Invisible Cities. And this popularity in the media is important to show that these good tourism alternatives are marketable, actually. So exciting to highlight there. The next challenge is that it's important to know the history of where the volunteerism got us today to understand kind of these neo-colonial power structures, because charitable tourism has existed since Thomas Cook in the 19th century, and it's directly tied to tourism's colonial roots. So this sense of othering is still rooted very much in tourism, and especially in volunteerism. In the industry establishing research of volunteerism, Guten Tag discusses this persistence of the neo-colonial power structures. And it showcases that this leads to the long-term effects on local development, since it keeps host communities from attaining self-sufficiency and sustainable economic growth. This lack of sincere engagement with the structural inequalities in the destination do actually have long-term effects on the local development if volunteerism is done wrong. In the most recent published literary review, looking at about 180 papers on this topic, the gap was noticed that volunteerists were measured 75% of the time. They were the main sample population. In other words, the other stakeholders, like the host community, were not researched. This research lags kind of far behind in the academic industry. So we must ask whose decisions are central to the volunteerism action. Are the community decisions central? And this answer is not well researched, but by the growth of for-profit operators in this field, it seems unlikely to me that it is the community. So it'll be our next and final point, as it's the crux of making volunteerism actually work, is community decision making. So we can look at the ways these practices are set up kind of in the framework. In the tourism industry, community-based tourism, or CBT, is this model where local residents own, manage, and directly benefit tourism activities and focuses on authentic experiences that minimize economic leakage and protect local heritage. So in this framework, there are opportunities for community decision-making and volunteerism, but there are many industry gaps cited in the UN volunteering article. Volunteer management is underdeveloped, cross-sectoral alliances are underdeveloped, and those are really vital for strengthening volunteering and the coordination to make it happen. So there is actually theoretical research published stating that channeling the motivation and resources of volunteers towards community-led initiatives, volunteerism can provide a positive impact, but there are gaps in the practices and management that have been identified. I would like to highlight that there are some standards that can be utilized from the code. There's fair trade learning, which is an ethical framework for international volunteerism, prioritizing reciprocity and sustainability, and various community-led initiatives that treat hosts not as passive recipients, but as aid and as equal partners. I have another example here, but I'm going to skip forward because I think I'm a little bit short on time. Just to finalize here, the value of volunteerism, as discussed, there are opportunities to benefit both communities and volunteers through volunteerism, but it does need to be researched further because it can celebrate the value of volunteering as well, and we can create ethical travelers and citizens through these experiences because it's driven by altruistic tendencies, which will continue. So thanks to the free market and advertising, further research should craft volunteer services that are good for all stakeholders. This is really imperative. So finally, as discussed in the beginning, this will best be done by the renovation of our vocabulary and our behavior. We should swap service and volunteering for the idea of engagement. We should act as guests, not as saviors. We should let local hosts lead the conversation and show visitors where they can provide value ethically. Thank you. I'll have the slides shared for later and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sure there are also many questions here to be made later. So now I'm passing on to a closed topic, the one that Neil has started talking about. And I'm passing now to Dr. Rebecca Knapp, who is the Senior Technical Advisor for the Better Care Network, the leading global child rights network driving action for children without parental care. With over 25 years of experience, she has in child protection and care system reform. Her work focuses on addressing orphanage trafficking and tourism, and is a member of the Australian Institute of Criminology's Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Research Network. So thank you very much for being here and from connecting from Sydney. So please, the floor is yours. Whenever you want, you can present your
Thank you, Constantina, and thank you to the Atlas community for having me join today, and particularly to Dr. Rodney Westerlecken for the invitation to come and present on behalf of your special interest group as well. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to be introducing you and hopefully starting a stimulating conversation on this subject of profiting from children's separation, which, as we heard from our previous speaker, is linked to this conversation on volunteerism. And so in this particular topic, what I want to focus on, in the volunteerism conversation and even within the orphanage volunteerism conversation, there are many different facets of harm that we can focus on. But in this session, the one in particular that I want to raise and bring to your attention is the impact of orphanage volunteerism on a child's right to family life, which is a key right enshrined in international child rights law. So when we're talking about orphanage volunteerism, it refers to visits and volunteering activities undertaken in orphanages as a part of a holiday, travel, tourism experience of some description. And when we use the word orphanage, we are talking about all forms of residential care, facilities for children, including children's homes, children's villages, children's centres, institutions, shelters, transit centres, and boarding houses. There are lots of different terms that can be used to encompass residential care, which is synonymous with orphanages. Orphanage tourism, volunteerism itself also encompasses quite a wide array of activities, including caregiving roles or teaching roles with children, recreational activities, open visiting hours where orphanages will advertise that travellers can come and visit between certain hours and engage with children in unstructured programs. It includes on-site maintenance, renovation, construction type activities, sometimes setting up income generating activities such as kitchen farms in orphanages. It also includes orphanage performances, which may be conducted on site, or these may take place in external tourism venues. Now, orphanage volunteerism has been documented in upwards of 20 countries, and it occurs primarily in low and middle income countries, particularly contexts where child protection and alternative care service are largely privatized, privately operated, privately funded, with a heavy reliance on overseas funding, and where government regulation and oversight over these services may be reasonably emergent or limited. Now, the practice does attract both domestic and international volunteers, although participation is predominantly international. And engagement can occur through multiple sectors and through multiple mechanisms, including schools that participate in global service learning trips, universities that are facilitating student exchange, placements, internships, gap year students who are engaging through commercial volunteerism providers, churches undertaking short-term missions trips, volunteering for development providers who are deploying volunteers through formal official assistance, development assistance programs with governments, tourism companies who are packaging orphanage visits as a part of impact tourism or cultural tourism programs, and charities that advertise volunteering opportunities directly in the orphanages that they run to their prospective or to their existing donor communities. Now, what's important to understand is that the primary utility of orphanage volunteerism lies in funding rather than labour. There's a bit of a narrative around it that volunteers come to assist with caregiving or to supplement gaps in labour or in staffing within these institutions, but that is very much a myth. The research that we conducted during COVID-19 to assess the impact of international border closures on orphanages across multiple countries, we found that the sudden loss of international volunteers had almost no effect on children's day-to-day supervision or caregiving. Almost none of the providers identified any negative consequences for children due to the loss of these volunteers. But conversely, numerous operators reported that they had seen observable improvements in children's well-being in the absence of volunteers and visitors, and they directly attributed this to improved attachments with caregivers and the lack of disruption of volunteers with attachment formation. The benefits of accepting volunteers were almost exclusively financial, generating immediate revenue through placement fees, through donations on site, facilitating fundraising events when volunteers return to their country of origin, and attracting and retaining longer-term volunteers. And while acknowledging that volunteers had a disruptive effect on children, almost all of these operators indicated that they had full intention to resume accepting volunteers and visitors once border restrictions were lifted. The principal motivation expressed was the reactivation of their donor pipelines and income generation. And so what this study and many others have demonstrated is that orphanage volunteerism is not a child welfare driven activity. It is an income generating activity, and albeit it is one that has serious consequences for children's life. For one of these consequences around children's rights is the consequences for the right to family life. Now, not only is orphanage volunteering associated with adverse impacts on children's development, their well-being, secure attachment formation, protective behaviours and their safety, it also has implication for children's fundamental right to family life. And this right to family life is a principle, a foundational principle within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It is also found within the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, the CRC reflects this presumption that a child's best interests are ordinarily served within the family environment, making the right to parental care or family and to grow up in a family environment both a substantive right and a cross-cutting theme throughout the Convention. There are numerous articles that detail different aspects of this right. Articles 5, 7, 8, 19, 16, and 18 collectively affirm that a child has a right to be known and cared for by their parents, protection from unlawful interference with family relations, freedom from unnecessary separation, and for the primary responsibility of parents to raise children, and the state's responsibility to support parents in exercising their caregiving duties through policies and services that are family oriented. Now, when children genuinely require alternative care, when staying within the family unit is not possible for their safety or for other reasons, family-based care must be prioritised, and residential care under international child rights law is limited to an exceptional and a temporary measure of last resort that must be used for the shortest duration possible. Now, taken together, international norms impose both a negative obligation on states to prevent arbitrary or unnecessary separation of children from their families, and a positive obligation to support families so that separation does not occur for social or material reasons. Now, whereas international child rights law obliges states to protect and to realise children's rights to family life, orphanage tourism is contingent on the very opposite dynamic. The demands of orphanage volunteerism require a steady supply of children who are separated from their families and residing long-term in residential care. Now, globally, approximately 80% of children in institutions have one or both living parents. Almost all of them have extended family members. These are not children who are in residential care because they were without caregivers. In the overwhelming majority of cases, these children are separated from their families for the purpose of admission into residential care, often for reasons attributable to poverty or access of services. Now, orphanage volunteerism incentivizes that separation. Its business model is dependent upon it. Orphanage operators and the broader network of actors that comprise the volunteerism supply chain, including sending organizations, travel intermediaries, fundraising platforms, they derive economic benefit from children's long-term separation from their family and their institutionalization. Now, studies in several countries have mapped the proliferation of orphanages alongside increase in tourism, including geographical clustering of orphanages along tourism routes. So to balance children's life with their right to family life and their right to protection and alternative care when generally required, governments have to establish what we refer to as gatekeeping mechanisms. Now, these are assessment and decision-making frameworks that are implemented by mandated child protection authorities and courts. And these gatekeeping mechanisms first determine whether or not a child must be removed from their family and referred to alternative care under conditions stipulated by law. And this is called the necessity principle, which is a key pillar principle of the UN guidelines on the alternative care for children. Now, necessity is both assessed at the point at which a child is referred to alternative care and periodically reviewed to ensure that children do not remain separated from their families for a longer duration than in what is required. If alternative care is deemed necessary, gatekeeping then determines what is the most appropriate form of alternative care for that individual child, and family-based care must be prioritised. Residential care, once again, is only to be used in exceptional circumstances, and these exceptional circumstances are regulated by law. But in some countries, as gatekeeping and regulatory frameworks have been strengthened, orphanages profiting from children's institutionalization through volunteerism have increasingly sought to circumvent those laws and those oversight mechanisms. Many are unregistered and therefore operating unlawfully. And to populate these institutions and attract donors and volunteers, children are sometimes recruited from their families, unlawfully removed and institutionalized, and in some cases under conditions that meet the criteria for orphanage trafficking under both international and domestic law. So protecting children from arbitrary interference in family life and unnecessary separation from their families is both an international and an intersectoral imperative. It requires whole of government approaches and meaningful cooperation between countries that send volunteers and funding to orphanages and countries that receive volunteers and funding. Sending states must fulfill their extraterritorial obligations to protect children's rights by providing clear guidance and extending the regulation over schools, universities, faith-based organizations, tourism and volunteerism companies and charities to include their activities that are outside of their own geographical borders. That's the extraterritorial element. Receiving states, in turn, need to strengthen the oversight and enforcement of their laws and gatekeeping mechanisms over residential care services, including prohibitions on orphanage volunteerism, so that children aren't being separated for profit purposes. At the same time, strengthening their child protection systems, increasing access to preventative services to support families, and reintegrating children who are in residential care back into community and families. They must also regulate their inbound tourism and volunteerism activities to ensure that they don't adversely impact upon the rights of children. So hoping to just pose a few questions for the debate at the end. In terms of how do we implement a framework that upholds a child's right to family in the context of volunteerism activities, to what extent should private sector be expected to self-regulate? Or to what extent should that regulation be imposed by law? To give effect to prohibitions or the international call for prohibitions against orphanage volunteerism, should it be outlawed? And if so, should laws target individuals or entities for sanctions associated with that activity being outlawed? And a question to this community, comprised of scholars in the tourism field: are tourism scholars prepared to advocate for regulation of volunteerism supply chain actors, including all the ones that we have already discussed and described, in the countries where you are based and where you are working? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the debate at the end.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, very focused presentation. I'm definitely sure we're going to have also many questions here. So now we go to our last presentation, and our last speaker is Dr. Guy Georgiev, who is a cultural heritage management specialist based at the Macau University of Tourism and the president of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Aerospace Heritage. His expertise spans digital humanities, decolonization and ethics, and heritage and archaeology. Guy, thank you very much also for being here. And please, the floor is yours for your presentation entitled Cultural Tourism, Consuming Heritage Places.
Thank you so much. Do you see my screen, right? So,
yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Constantina, for great introduction, and thank you so much for the speakers. I learned so much. My presentation will feel a little bit different, I think, in its approach, and also it's in its content as well. It's very difficult to follow such a good range of very difficult and hard topics here, very dark topics here. But I'll try to talk about cultural heritage on this occasion in particular. So, when I heard about the title of this event, I decided to play with the idea of a consumption in both ways: consuming as tourists, going to the places and using them and enjoying them, but also making an impact on heritage places, but also consuming of the heritage places of a different nature, by making those places very different, by in essence pushing out the communities that make those places in the first place. So, in a diversity of heritage sites around the world, I'm sure this community is well aware of the cultural heritage assets as humanity that we celebrate and that we enjoy as tourism destinations as well. I wanted to focus on a specific monuments and the specific sites that are, in a way, represent the complex sites that are very functioning with its living community, with its current community as well. So sites like this one, for example, this is Ichan Kala in modern-day Uzbekistan, where I spent a lot of time since 2018 working with the UN tourism colleagues, but also with the development banks, banks like EBRD, on specifically designing sustainable tourism programs for a World Heritage Sites that has a permanent population of about 3,000 people. And it's a beautiful site, as you see here on this picture, but it is also one of those sites that attracts more and more tourists in each season. So it's growing in its popularity, it's becoming better connected, and the country itself is opening up its visa regime, it's easing its visa conditions, and that results in a mass influx of tourists going into these areas. And I'm not necessarily trying to focus here on over-tourism or unbalanced tourism, whatever term we are comfortable with these days. We are not necessarily finding quick answers on those aspects, either, as we know, in multiple of the heritage sites, and this community will be well familiar with those concepts. But even my point here is that, but even acceptable levels of tourism is also causing issues for us from cultural heritage management point of view, from the point of view of preventing sites going into decay, preserving their authenticity, preserving their integrity in a longer term. When it comes especially to the very valuable sites that are great representation of the human past and heritage assets of that regions, then this problem becomes even more problematic. And one of the problems that we face is that in the past it used to be about communities being moved away from the sites because of the needs of tourism development or because of the infrastructure development needs. And those issues are addressed very well now. I think in an academic community there is a lot of discussions on those topics, and the policymakers are well aware of the context and the problems that it may cause longer term. And the colleagues from urban development field, for example, they're great advocates in this area as well. But there is a different type of a kind of a movement of population happening in these sites like the Ichankala I use here, where tourism is pushing out the communities almost by their agreement. So the communities are not necessarily against the idea of tourism, and I spend a lot of time talking to community representatives there. They're very keen to accommodate more tourism because this is economically beneficial, because it guarantees in a way, in most people's view, a better future for their children and their grandchildren longer term. And these places themselves are not very easy in terms of their adaptation to modern needs. So historic city like Ichankala that you see here is very difficult in terms of infrastructure development, and one of the great alternatives that the governments and the urban authorities there offer to population is basically rehousing them in different areas. There is also a different type of a problem where the local population decides to convert their existing residences into dedicated guest houses. And that's also one of the major problems in a dense, compact urban areas, urban in a sense of a late medieval urban development here. And those problems are very obvious in this area. But the point here is that the communities themselves, or heritage management authorities necessarily, they're not against that move. They're not against that development. They're not against that change. And that change is having a longer term impact in terms of how we manage these sites, because as you can see from this picture, there are multiple developments happening within the city, within that dedicated World Heritage Site, and the multiple changes are happening just outside of that boundary as well. So I noticed the communities gradually disappearing from the historic core of the place. And this is important because in terms of the heritage management, but also in terms of the cultural tourism, heritage tourism, historic fabric was only part of it. Actually, what made it valuable was the social fabric. What was valuable about this place is that the communities which are there constantly and continuously, several generations already, that was a valuable asset, both in terms of the making the narrative and in terms of the making tourism itself more acceptable, more understandable. Local histories, as Anil mentioned earlier, that those were the ones that made tourism so much better than any other comparable site. And so the community's movement from this place to other places causing problems for tourism, but also it's causing a significant heritage management challenge. So one of the problems I would like to highlight here is in one picture here you see the development of the guest house that's using modern materials, which is problematic within the context of the urban preservation and the preservation of the historic fabric, because concrete and fired brick being introduced into these areas is quite a significant problem. And also this building is having an impact in subterranean archaeology. For people like myself coming from archaeological background is really problematic too. And the speed of that change has been quite substantial, and this is not only one site that we are talking about. There are multiple sites in the developing world that I observe, especially with my ICOMOS and World Heritage related hat on, that I observe continuously, that these changes, driven usually by communities themselves, by people's individual decisions within their households, that's causing quite a substantial change in a historic fabric of the place. And we, from ethical point of view, we as heritage specialists, especially being outsiders, we have a limited kind of a capacity to intervene into those processes. And in most places, these are also, to a certain degree, allowable within the heritage protection legislation as well. The other side of it is that buildings themselves, the historic fabric itself, and then the monuments, the structures, most of them have a huge symbolic, religious, and otherwise significance for the communities. And the communities were the best people who knew how to look after those buildings. Those were the best guardians that we could ever have. And this is, again, it's not only the problem for this locality, but it's a problem in a global sense as well. And losing that guardianship, losing that traditional knowledge of looking after the buildings, and also looking after the buildings not only in terms of the restoration or conservation of those buildings, but day-to-day care and day-to-day function of those buildings, we are losing something that's quite valuable from heritage management point of view, that's quite valuable from tourism point of view as well. And that causes great challenges going further into the future, in my view. So, and then communities themselves, for example, the other picture here is the local children who I become very close friends over the years, and them gradually disappearing from that landscape. Yes, they're going into the different parts of the modern city, and yes, they probably will have a better conditions in terms of the households and in terms of the living conditions. But it is causing certain level of disappearance of local culture, disappearance of the local interactions. That's also finding its reflections in the narratives of the visitors as well. So the repeat visitors highlight those points in their conversations with people like me, for example, that this is changing the fabric of the locality and causing certain levels of damage. Now, within this all, I'm probably, some of the listeners probably thinking, where is the darker element of this? The darker element for me is that loss of communities and the loss of that guardianship, loss of that knowledge is going to be one of the darker moments, even if it's not today, even if it's not today from a point of an ordinary visitor, but only visible to the specialists who are interested in that aspect. It's going to create landscapes, cultural landscapes that are basically devoid of its culture to a certain degree. Yes, they may function still as an archaeological landscapes, they may function actually as a historic remains as well, but the most valuable element of it may be lost. And also some of the architecture, some of the elements, as you can see here in one picture, the mud brick buildings being destroyed in that locality. This is really heartbreaking for people like me who spend a lot of time working with the earthen architecture, and its properties for current problems in terms of the sustainability, but in terms of the climate change resilience and the other aspects of the modern day global challenges. Seeing those types of buildings, residential buildings being demolished and being replaced in wholesale in a way by the more modern alternatives, which are more tourism friendly, certainly creates a landscape that may one day be kind of known as a darker remains of the tourism. So not necessarily the dark tourism maybe right now, but in the future where that takes us philosophically, but also where that takes us as tourism scholars in our discussions of the future of those landscapes. Do they become a bit like other landscape? Here I selected a picture of an empty heritage site, which is also a World Heritage Site, but it doesn't necessarily have a community that resides there. It doesn't necessarily have a social fabric anymore. It's a frozen in time, as it were, landscape that's actively used for tourism, but for a very different type of tourism. So that community element of tourism, and losing those guardianship, those guardians who were there, and also losing the narratives that we benefited over the years, the narratives that the local community delivered, both as tour guides, but also as interactions between tourists and the locals, that have been a very interesting aspect of the tourism development, and that's being lost at the moment. Once again, this is not a one side. I'm not trying to just highlight one. I don't want my colleagues from Uzbekistan to find me criticizing them. I'm not necessarily criticizing them, but the process itself is worth investigating, I think, and also worth raising an alarm to a certain degree as well in our international discussions of the tourism development, but also where it takes us in the longer term future. So I will stop here because I think that we have to keep the overall timetable going as well. Thanks so much. I'll be very happy to engage with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your presentation. And we're closing in a different way, in a less dark way than the previous
Yes.
presentation. So that's a good way just to close a series of presentations. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for your contributions and for your experiences and for what with us today. Basically, me coming from also the dark tourism SIG, it was easy for me, or it was clear to me to see that this kind of perspective is not just about what is being projected, but also we could also question who is actually the dark one here. Is it us ourselves when we apply roles of being a tourist? And we do not know exactly how to play well that role when we go to different sites. Is it us when we decide how to manage a specific site and specific place, a specific storytelling, when we want to show it off to people who do not know it? Or is it just the story that the place itself also hides and has there for us? So I think many different questions could be on here. So now I would like to pass the word to Elisa Buray, who will moderate that debate part and the questions that everybody that is listening to us today may have. So Elisa?
Thank you, Constantina, and thanks everybody for your insightful presentations. As Constantina said, there is so much to think about and so many questions that came up from your presentation. So I'm actually looking forward to, of course, the audience questions and engaging in insightful debates on these topics. So I've got, obviously, I'd invite everyone to ask questions live if you feel comfortable. Just a little reminder that, of course, if you put your camera on and if you speak live, you'll be recorded as well. This is a little reminder. I'm very happy to take questions in the chat as well. We have one. I'd like to start with that, and then we open the floor to more questions. I think it's more for you, Guy, this question, or heritage experts. So David asked in the chat about the commodification of places through tourism. Much attention is given to global platforms and tourism marketing, but what about local producers? In my research on wineries communication, I see that producers themselves also construct narratives of place through social media. Could local actors like wineries simultaneously resist and participate in the commodification of their own territories? So that's the question for the heritage experts and Guy in particular.
Well, I think there are quite a few colleagues here who are great heritage experts, but I'll try my best to answer this. David, thanks so much. I think this is a very good question. We were actually discussing this in my with my PhD students today in a dedicated seminar to production of culture and what does that mean, and who are the gatekeepers, but also who has a role in that process, because it's a very complex process of commodification of culture, but also actually production of what we call culture. And even those elements are as wide as it deserves another long discussion probably. But to your point, I think if I understood this correctly, yes, wineries are both critical of others in a way commodifying or trying to benefit from their production that's very close to their hearts, but at the same time themselves participating in that process through social media, trying to celebrate their products. I think if I understood that correctly, and we see this again, not only wines, but all sorts of culture creative industry products in general, I think they have every right to celebrate their products and also to popularize their product. I think, if anything, my view will be giving them more agency in that, because they're interested ultimately in gaining momentum, both in terms of the economic benefits, but also they would like to see some recognition. And it's important for their identities, it's important for localities' identity, especially those wine producing regions, really important for them to be celebrated, to be known. So I think I'm really hard pressed to resist against that. That's a good idea. But they will be the right people probably to know the limits of how far to push that narrative as well, because there are lots of anecdotes from my travels in Europe where local wineries will at some point say, no, we actually don't have many more bottles of this. And so they may be the ones who will judge correctly, if anything. Now, in terms of the others doing it on their behalf, it also can sometimes work. We have communities of producers who actually rely on international experts or expertise or groups, very similar to volunteering in other sectors, people who are retired professionals helping those destinations to brand themselves, helping those cultural products to brand themselves. So again, nothing wrong with that, but they will at least do that. They usually will do it at least in collaboration with those communities. So I think there is a question of agency. Who is a kind of an intellectual owner of that cultural output, be it a wine, be it a handcrafts, be it other things, and who is then the promoter and who's benefiting from that. If the benefits are directly going to those communities and those communities are knowingly doing the promotion themselves, so I think there is less resistance from my part, at least, to that. And maybe others would like to add to this.
Thank you, Guy. I don't see any other question in the chat at the moment, but I'd invite the audience to ask questions. David said thank you as well, Guy. So yeah. Okay, so yeah, so there's a comment for Rebecca in the chat. I might just leave you to read that because it's not a question as such, but it's more an invitation to keep in touch. The fact that they enjoyed your presentation a lot. I have a lot of questions. If I don't see any from the audience, and I know that Constantina might have a few as well. Right. I'm not sure how to put this. I start from the broad. So we talked a lot about shades of darkness, and I think that the dark side touches upon the different topics that we've heard about today. So volunteer tourism, obviously dark tourism, heritage, and the orphanage tourism. And there's lots of interconnections among this topic. I'm curious to find out, and this is a question for all the speakers, whoever feels comfortable and as a view on this. How do you see the concept of morality and ethics evolving in such a challenging and evolving time? So, where perhaps we are feeling differently about the concept of solidarity, about the concept of consumption, commodification, within the various, within geopolitical instability. I know this is very broad, but, do you think there is a different way of experiencing moral consumption and moral production, and how morality is evolving across the various topics?
Could I jump in there initially?
Please, Phil. Yes, thank you.
Morality is a key point of this kind of looking at dark tourism through different lenses. And I know I did a paper quite a long time ago now on the reconstruction of morality within secular societies, and put it very much in a kind of a secular religious framework, and use the idea of collective effervescence, this idea of embodiment in places of fatality, and how morality is then conveyed. And we've got this thing, when I was talking about new materialism, that ties very much into that debate of how morality is constructed and reconstructed, and very much in secular societies, where the ethical answers that we seek are not from religious leaders anymore. They are from popular culture, they are from social media. And we live in this post-truth world where truth is very much a commodity to hand. And we, even in the last couple of years with Trump and the Pandora's box that he's kind of opened. So morality is very much a commodity to be had, and also responsibility. And I think as research goes forward, is using that sense of embodiment as how morals and the ethical envelope is pushed ever forward in places of heritage, difficult heritage, dark tourism, whatever you want to call it, because there lies in the responsibility of the intellectual owner, let's call them, the curator, the production manager, the memory manager, but also what tourists who perhaps don't have a very good education or have a basic education of how morality is actually conveyed. So it's a really important question in a secular society where religion, for many people, not all, is not as important.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think yeah, Guy.
No, thank you. This is fantastic, and Philip really nailed it. I think in the hit the nail on the head, because this is exactly at this time we should be talking more about the morality because of the affairs, international affairs, and because of what we see. And I think from that point of view, ethics is important. As a researcher, we probably more comfortable with the concept of ethics. That's in a more philosophical academic level, what we discussed as well. But we shouldn't also be shy of using morality as a concept, exactly as Philip said, not necessarily as a religious concept, but as a very secular way as well. And here, I mean, Rebecca's point about making these issues known as a community of researchers ourselves is really, really important. I think we shouldn't be shying away from those discussions. But also, I think that Neil's points about how the volunteering happening and what's the causes and what are the results of that, all of those things, in a way, this is a very good group here, good discussions, good presentations here that showed that aspect that we are pushing towards more ethics driven and in real terms, not in terms of the just making a tick box somewhere, but also arguing the morality point in a very substantial way, based on data, based on observations, based on long-term discussions as well. I think, yeah, we should be certainly pushing towards that.
Thank you, Guy. I've got a few more questions, but I'll wait for the audience, and or Konstantin as well. Please feel free to interject. I don't think there's anyone with a hand up at the moment.
Okay,
yeah.
I can ask also. Well, ask, comment, etc. Well, basically, one of the things that from all conversations was made quite clear and concerning for me also is that part of the educational role that supposedly speaking also tourism covers. We say that a lot. We'll learn a lot through tourism. If you move around the world, you will open your eyes, you will be a better person, supposedly speaking. You will understand life better. And these particular types of tourism that cases that we have been talking in this webinar have a huge impact, because they are quite what we basically may be seeing at home. And they ask and they require a particular preparation from us in order for us to be able to understand some things better. I think that in this glimpse that we are giving as tourists when we are doing a specific trip to orphanage tourism or through a volunteer experience, that we want also some free time, as Neil said, because we want to have our break from what we are doing or living at that moment, and then we go back at our lives. This is basically the role of the tourist now. But I think it's a huge challenge, this educational part, this pedagogical role of doing dark tourism to understand better the history or the difficulties of a territory and a specific site, or for understanding doing volunteer tourism, which is more active. So voyeuristic in its sense that you can help the community but then you leave, or going in an orphanage tourism, which is even more specific and see a very, very concrete reality of the lives of kids. And on many occasions in that aspect, it has been said that it's a dangerous thing to do. It's a dangerous thing in the sense that the negative impact of tourism has been on many occasions reported. So my question at the end of all this is, how could we ever handle that kind of challenge? How could we prepare tourists to be able to have the correct view and the correct behavior when they are actually visiting places that have a completely different reality? And my concern basically focuses on the fact that in tourism, until recently, well, not that recently, but the dark parts or the negative parts were not the highlight of tourism. But now, on the other hand, on television, we see a lot of negative things, not only on the reality part, but also on the entertainment part. So our eyes are very much accustomed to seeing complicated lives, let's say, of people. So how does that actually educate us or help us in a moral point of view when we actually do tourism in those places, in these sites, to be better prepared? My preoccupation mostly goes on the demand side than on the offer side. How do we educate people before they actually go there to behave correctly, or to behave in correctly is a very abstract way to say it, but to behave in a way that side also deserves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll start because I think this definitely highlights a lot of the issues that I was directly looking at, and that the research has identified all the way from these altruistic behaviors and the reasons that people are choosing to volunteer outside of their community from the get-go. And then the preparation phase, which has definitely been noted in research, is lacking. And I think this is the first big answer to your question, is how the preparation is done, of course, for anyone heading into any of these types of experiences. What knowledge do they have? How they have they engaged with the challenges? And are they ready to challenge their expectations? And then do they have space to reflect on it, which leads to the post-trip portion of actual transformation and development that could come. I don't think there's that much research that proves that this is possible. I think we all want to believe this. And I think it's on us as tourism practitioners and researchers to continue to dive in to see if this is possible. But in my perspective, the big issues are actually before and after the experiences, not actually. We have a lot of information about what's happening on the ground.
Can I add
Yes,
to
please,
that,
Rebecca.
just leveraging what Neil has shared? I think in the specific space that we're focusing on, which is volunteerism with children and specifically in residential care, one of the issues is that when we've engaged with volunteerism providers, more specifically, there's been a lot of kickback around the educational component, because education in this sense would actually compromise the economic model. The more people understand about children, child rights, children's care, the obligations of governments to reform child protection systems, the less they're able to access those forms of volunteerism, and that impacts upon the economic model of those organizations and agencies. So there's a disincentive to actually utilizing those trips for more grounded educational purposes. We've also found that in many cases there's a limited kind of appetite amongst the volunteerists for that type of education, because it reduces the touch and feel component that they're really looking for. One of the alternatives that's often been provided to volunteerism with children is educational trips, where they may sit down with organizations who are engaged in child-focused activities or child rights activities, and they'll learn, or they may be able to provide administrative support to those organizations. The appetite for that is significantly reduced when compared to the touch, feel, cuddle a child in an orphanage type of experience. So I think there's a tension between the educational component and opportunity and the experiential component that many volunteerists are looking for, that is yet to be kind of fully reconciled in terms of how these opportunities can be used to better educate people about critical social issues.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, I definitely agree. And on then answer that Neil has provided just before you, we have a follow-up question from Louisa, who's asking, to what extent is that made to the tourist experience rather than a focus to the community? And then I've got another question from Louisa, but that is more open to
Exactly.
all
Well,
the
I think this is
speakers.
the biggest challenge in a, market-driven industry, right? We live in an unregulated, global, complex society where these experiences are going to be taking place. And so there is actors who are acting well and actors who are not acting well. And that answers your questions. I think it depends on who's managing the experiences and who's making the decisions across the board of what's happening. So volunteerism and dark experiences can happen if they're developed by people who have the perspective that can be delivered properly, understanding those local experiences.
Thanks, Neil. And again, Louisa is opening a question that is a bit broader on the kind of discrepancy between ethics and morality when the tourism industry is looking forward on creating more and more experiences that might have negative impacts on the community. So the creation of experiences from an industry point of view and the negative impacts that the community might experience. Do you have an idea how these two can be, reconciled and, combined in a kind of balanced way? And this is for everyone, really. And I know that is complicated.
Can I just jump in here? I think because we talk about education, and really education, again, is a socially constructed idea, because what we educate is purposeful, and it's based on biases and all sorts of different things. And I think we've got to go back to the beginning. And again, it takes this kind of post-structural approach to it in terms of how knowledge and power are interrelatable. And really, remembrance is a political tool. To remember is also to forget, and we purposely forget. Dark tourism is littered with selective amnesia. Take slavery heritage in Britain, for example. We focus very much on the abolition of slavery in this country, where we don't very much focus on our role in slavery. The Holocaust memorials in Auschwitz-Birkenau focus on the Jewish genocide rather than the genocide of other peoples, for example. And Ground Zero is another example where morality is reconstructed in a visitor setting. And it's very much about the attack on American power and hegemonic standing in the world, rather than why it happened. So remembrance is very much a political, and it always will be. So we live in this post-truth world where people are searching for the answer. And I guess I'm just going to finish on the idea that what John Uri was talking about, post-tourism, where people know it's a game, know it's not real. And that becomes really dangerous, I guess, in the kind of the darker aspects of tourism, this idea of post-tourism. So yeah, I haven't got no answers, but it's very much a selective process.
That's great. I'll come back to you. We've got 4 minutes left, but I might be able to come back to you, Phil, with another question on this element of politics. Guy?
Yeah, no, I think that going back to Constantina's point, but also going into the question, I have a very interesting experience. Before COVID, for about 4 years, I did one tour myself as a kind of a more educational heritage tour, and taking mostly people who are in a retirement age, and they will do the readings beforehand, and then there will be an evening lecture sometimes. And also the guiding the tours is essentially about the knowledge and the educational experiences, and also doing what's right for the community. So I was selected specifically for that because I spoke the languages, I understood the communities, etc., etc. So yes, I understand that I'm probably biased, that I will say it was a good tour, but the feedback suggests that this was an exceptionally valuable experience for them as well. I think the humanities' willingness to learn and the willingness to do the right things hadn't disappeared in a way, despite our times and despite looking around or looking at the news. So I think there is an element of doing that, and the agency is with everyone, not only with us, with academics, but also tour companies and everything. What's important for looking at the question is that nobody within the chain says that we want to do tourism wrongly. The days of not understanding negatives of tourism is long gone. 2 decades ago, maybe some people pretended that they didn't understand the issues of tourism. But now it's a well-known issue there, from UN Tourism all the way down to the national agencies, to different tour companies. None of them are necessarily saying that they want to do the bad tourism or uneducational tourism or disrespect of the communities. But we suddenly find ourselves in those positions nevertheless. Yes, maybe the profit is a problem, maybe the markets are the problems. But again, maybe we also have a little bit of a power there in terms of critiquing that, in terms of promoting that, and the organizations that we heard today, very valuable experiences. Maybe as a community, we also should be highlighting these aspects of positive developments as well, maybe. Mm-hmm. My forward-looking positivist kind of thing.
That's great. There's a question for you in a moment, but just to go back to Phil's point before, I think the question of Arturo links well to that, in the sense that he's asking, do you think some people create dark or sensational story mainly to increase sales instead of telling the truth? But also I would add, in line to what you were saying, Phil, before, which truth I mean, and whose stories as well, to go back to Guy's presentation, you know, in terms of involving the communities, in telling their histories, and in unfolding their social and historic fabric, whose members, which members of the local communities, and who, you know, which history belongs to them, and what do they want to show, and what you know, and yeah, how are these narrated, and who's excluded and included, and it goes back to other presentations. But yeah, the truth, I think, in an age of misinformation, I think is an important element to, and very political as well, that runs through.
Just to put it at the answer, a very short answer to that sensational stories. The answer is yes, always has been and always will be. I've just finished a study on Jack the Ripper and necropolitics, and how the tabloid press at that particular time, you know, sensationalized the stories to drive newspaper sales, but also very much early tourism. You know, to see the corpse of the ladies still in the back alleys that were murdered by Jack the Ripper. So sensationalism, the idea of kitschifying and rendering the story into saleable goods and souvenirs will always be the case.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. And again, for Guy, is Joachim's question on, isn't it inevitable that as society evolve, communities will want to change and grow? If tourism becomes the main source of income, even if it's not ideal, could it still be the path that helps them to achieve their aspirations? And there is an example from Uzbekistan.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question, Joachim. Thank you so much. This is really, tourism is not the only source of income, but tourism is actually the biggest source of income. So these imbalances are so much there that it's very difficult to, for example, people building guest houses instead of residential houses, they're all changing residentials into guest houses. I speak the local dialect, and I'm from that region myself originally, so I understand people's day-to-day concerns really, really well. And it is inevitable to a certain degree, you are right, that some of these heritage places will eventually be abandoned more or less fully because of the societal needs, because of the infrastructure, connectivity, and everything else. Within that, though, there are very good global case studies where we actually see that some community members decide nevertheless to carry on with the knowledge, traditional knowledge, what we call knowledge holders, as it were. What worries me is that by people abandoning those areas willingly, as I pointed out in my presentation as well, this is not the case when they're being displaced forcefully, they're willingly going away from there. We may still preserve somehow those traditional elements of traditional knowledge, and that's still possible. And that's possible also through, what's the right word for this, from the support from tourism side as well. There are a lot of examples. I'm not going to go into the case studies here on those aspects.
We don't have time, Guy. I'm sorry, but yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. Sorry.
I have to say, it's never enough time when we have such wonderful conversations, and it was very ambitious to have 4 amazing speakers with us today. They brought up so many different insights. So we definitely have to have more of these. Constantina, thank you so much for organizing this, as well as all the Atlas team that is working behind the scenes, but they are there and they've been very supportive and instrumental for make this happening. So thank you so much for really your time and insights. I might reach out to a few of you separately just to follow up these great conversations. Constantina, do you want to say something?
Well, once again, thank you everyone for your contributions, for everything you have mentioned, for all the debates, for all the topics that have come up. There are many things to talk in depth and many small issues that are all very, very interesting and important. We would really like to think of the possibility of reorganizing similar webinars in the near future so that we can give space to more topics and give them more protagonism and give them more time to be developed with your questions. It was a real pleasure having you here. It was a real pleasure listening to you and talking about these things. And I really, really hope that very soon we can be again in another similar space and continue our conversations, hopefully with better news, whatever that may mean. And once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for the people who have just listened to us. for many countries that have connected today. Thank Atlas for the space, for the logistics, for the help, the moral support, and hopefully we're all going to be again in another similar space and continue speaking about these issues that always develop and so much is happening. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you all.
Potatoes that were fried in peanut oil.
Sugar? Is sugar after that one?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Did you stop, Constantina? Did you stop streaming, or is it still streaming?